The Houston suburb of Katy hummed with a sticky, restless buzz that humid June evening in 2025, the air heavy with the scent of Gulf salt and gasoline drifting through the open windows of the packed CIVYC Center. Rows of metal chairs groaned under a crowd of local soil workers in sweat-stained caps, their hands rough from rigs. Retirees clutching sweet tea cups, the ice clinking faintly. Families fanning themselves with flyers, the paper wilting in the damp heat. They'd gathered under the drone of ceiling fans to hear Ted Cruz, the bearded Texas senator, whose crisp suit and booming drawl turned the modest hall into a crucible of anticipation. The space, usually a stage for school plays and town votes, pulsed with a different tension tonight, as if the peeling paint walls held their breath. His voice rolled over the murmur's energy, freedom, Texas toughness, his hands jabbing the air like a prizefighter. The crowd clapped unevenly, some cheering with gruff enthusiasm, others shifting with quiet doubt, the energy more cautious than the roaring rallies of his past. Outside, cicadas shrieked in the dusk, their drone mingling with the hum of distant traffic, but inside, in the sixth row, a small figure sat poised, a flicker of resolve glowing beneath a crown of black braids, her presence a soft ripple against the room's steady churn. 8-year-old Ava sat with her legs crossed, her braids swaying as she hugged a faded green backpack to her chest, her sandals tapping the floor in a faint rhythm. Her sunflower dress bright yellow against the muted sea of khaki and denim shone like a beacon in the dim light. Beside her, her father, a lean man in an Astros cap, his hands scarred from years at the refinery, kept his gaze on Cruz, his jaw tight with a mix of pride and unease. Inside Ava's backpack wasn't a doll or a juice box, but a worn journal, its pages a patchwork of purple marker questions she'd scrawled under the flicker of a porch light, born from a fear she couldn't shake. "You don't have to say it, baby girl," he'd muttered as they'd left their shotgun house that evening, the screen door creaking shut, his voice low with worry. He's a senator. But Ava's dark eyes had flared, her grip tightening on the straps. "I need him to know," she'd said, and he'd seen a spark in her he couldn't dim, a spark ignited by a summer that wouldn't end. 2 months ago, Ava's world had shifted. A heat wave had gripped Katy, the kind that baked the asphalt until it shimmered, the kind that drove her family indoors as the AC wheezed and sputtered. She'd watched her little brother, Jamal 5, all giggles and gap teeth collapse in the yard, his breath shallow from heat stroke, the ambulance siren a wail she couldn't unhear. He'd served VY Ved, but the doctor's words lingered. "It's getting worse every year." Ava had grown up on her dad's tales fishing in cool creeks, summers that didn't burn but the cracked earth outside. The news clips of floods and fires didn't match. She'd started writing in that journal doodles of melting suns, wavy lines for heat-then questions, sharp and urgent, until they shaped the one she carried now, a burden she needed to lay bare. Cruz powered through his speech oil jobs, border walls, keeping Texas strong, his beard bristling as he grinned, drawing hoots and scattered applause. He spoke of energy independence, of fighting the green agenda, his voice a steady drumbeat of defiance. Ava watched, her stillness stark against the fidgeting kids nearby, her fingers tracing her backpack's zipper, her eyes tracking Cruz's every move, the way his fists punched the air, the way his grin stayed fixed, a wall she couldn't breach. The crowd stirred, some nodding with pride, others slumping with a weariness born of storms and bills. An oil worker in the back adjusted his cap, muttering about rigs. A grandmother beside him fanned herself, her sigh thick with humidity. But Ava sat like a sentinel, her breath tight, her heart pounding as she waited for her moment. The moderatora, balding man with a clipboard and a nervous tick called for questions, and the room came alive. Hands rosy, a mechanic grumbling about fuel costs, his voice rough with grease. A nurse asking about health care, her tone clipped. A retiree fussing over taxes, his glasses fogging as he spoke. Cruz answered each with a booming, practiced e-stats about drilling permits, nods to Texas grit, a quip about Washington liberals. The crowd clapped politely, some cheering, others exchanging glances that hinted at doubts unvoiced. The response is loud, but not deep, like thunder without rain. Ava's father glanced at her, his Astros cap shadowing a worried brow. "Sure about this, Ava?" he whispered, his scarred hand hovering near hers. But she shook her head, her braids swaying, and slid off her chair with a soft thud that pierced the hum. She moved forward, her sandals slapping the tile, her steps steady as she threaded through the maze of knees and chairs to the microphone stand. The crowd barely noticed at first, their focus still on Cruz's latest jab something about tree huggers, but then heads turned, eyes narrowing as this small figure emerged from the throng. Whispers buzzed, "Who's that kid? What's in the bag?" "She's tiny." Their voices a low hum that swelled as she reached the front. She stood there, dwarfed by the mic, her green backpack a shield against the rising tide of stares. The moderator faltered, his clipboard trembling, his mouth opening to redirect, but Ava raised a small hand, claiming her turn with a quiet resolve that stilled the room. The chatter faded, a heavy silence settling like heat over the bayou, every rustle and cough swallowed by the hush. Cruz paused, his head tilting, his sharp gaze softening with a flicker of amusement as he leaned on the podium. "Well, howdy there, young lady," he said, his drawl thick and warm, a grin tugging at his beard. "What's on your mind?" Ava unzipped her backpack, pulled out her journal, flipped to a page marked with a sun, and took a shaky breath. "Senator Cruz," she began, her voice soft but ablaze. "You say Texas is tough, so why is it so hot my brother almost died?" The word struck like a spark in dry grass, clear and searing, splitting the calm with a truth too raw to dodge. Cruz's grin froze, his eyes widening, his hands tightening on the podium as the crowd gasped a sharp, collective inhale that sucked the air dry. His face, a bastion of swagger and certainty, buckled shot car VY-ing lines across his brow, unease flickering in his gaze, a crack he couldn't mask in that moment. An 8-year-old had exposed him bare. The silence stretched, thick and sweltering, a storm brewing in the KDCI VYC Center as Ava's question hung in the air, its simplicity slicing through the bluster of Cruz's rhetoric. It wasn't just a child's worry, it was a shard of reality piercing the heart of his platform, a plea wrapped in marker that demanded more than bravado. The ceiling fans droned on, their blades cutting through the stillness, casting jagged shadows that danced across the chairs. Cruz stood rooted, his knuckles whitening against the podium, his polished shell fraying under a scrutiny he hadn't braced for in any debate or stump speech. His eyes darted to the crowd searching for an anchor, stalling for a foothold, then snapped back to Ava, who stood firm, her journal clutched like a torch, its purple scrawl a quiet cry against the heat he couldn't deny. The room's buzz dissolved, every shuffle of a flyer, every clink of a cup, every stifled breath drowned by a hush that throbbed with her fear. This wasn't a pundit's barb or a protester's chant, it was a little girl's truth, its honesty a spotlight on a man who'd built his name on defiance, and it burned hotter than he could bear. Ava didn't flinch. Her sandals stayed planted, her dark eyes unyielding, daring him to answer not with boasts, but with something real. Her father sank lower in his chair, his cap slipping as he rubbed his neck, caught between pride and dread for the fire his daughter had lit. Whispers flared, "She's got a point. What's he gonna say?" "That's heavy." Their voices a low, urgent buzz that swelled and then hushed as the moderator waved him down, his clipboard shaking like a reed in a gale. Cruz cleared his throat, a rough growl breaking the quiet, and tugged his tie, a reflex, a lifeline he grasped as the room waited. "That's a big one, darlin'," he said finally, his drawl quieter now, stripped of its bombast, the warmth fraying into something unsteady. The crowd leaned in, their bodies a sea of tilted heads and wide eyes, sensing a fracture in the man who'd roared through Senate halls, a crack that widened with every second he struggled to fill. He took a deep breath, his chest VYing under his suit, and met Ava's unflinching stare with eyes that flickered, just for a moment, with something unguarded out, perhaps, or a memory he'd pushed down. "I grew up in Houston," he began, his voice softening into something raw, almost hesitant, running around in the summers, fishing in the bayous with my dad, sweating through July like every Texas kid. It was hot, sure, but we managed fans, iced tea, toughing it out. That's how we did it. His words trailed off, and for a heartbeat, he wasn't the senator who defied storms and critics, just a man peering into a past that didn't fit the present he'd shaped. The crowd held its breath, the oil worker in the back pausing mid-sip, the grandmother's fan stilled in her hand. Every eye locked on Cruz as he stood suspended in his own story. Ava tilted her head, her braids swaying gently, her silence a quiet demand that pressed him deeper into the moment. "I've got a daughter, Beatrice. She's a little older than you," Cruz continued, his voice steadying but laced with a tremor he couldn't hide. "She loves the outdoors camping, chasing fireflies. But a couple years back," he faltered, his throat bobbing as he swallowed hard, his hands tightening on the podium until the wood creaked. "My niece, Clara, she was 6, got sick after a flood, bad water, heat making it worse. We prayed, took her to the doc, but she didn't pull through. I told my sister it was just bad luck. Pushed for oil jobs to keep us strong, figured that's what Texas needed. But hearing you, Ava," his voice broke, a sharp, brittle crack that echoed through the hall, and he looked down, blinking hard against the tears welling in his eyes, his beard shadowing a face that couldn't hide the weight. The crowd gasped, a jagged wave of shock and empathy that rolled through the chairs like a gust over the Gulf. A nurse in the front row pressed a hand to her chest, her sob muffled but piercing. An oil worker muttered Jesus under his breath, his cap dipping low. A young mom in the back clutched her teacup, her eyes glistening as she nodded slowly. Ava's father looked up from his cap, his scarred hands trembling, a tear streaking down his cheek to drip onto the tile. Leah VY-ing a dark spot that spread like ink. Cruz's words weren't just an answer, they were a confession, a crack in the armor of a man who'd built his career on strength, and they landed with a force that shook the room to its core. Cruz pressed on, his voice firming but hollowed out, as if the admission had drained something vital from him. "We're fighting for jobs, oil, gas, keeping Texas MOVYing. I've stood up to the climate crowd, pushed back on their rules. I'm not stopping." The words rang thin, a politician's echo drowned by the vulnerability he'd let slip. Ava's brow furrowed, her hands tightening on her journal until the pages crinkled, her lips pressing into a line that said she wasn't here for excuses, she wanted truth, something to hold when the heat climbed and Jamal's breaths faltered again. The crowd sensed it too, their murmurs shifting from awe to unease, a restless energy bubbling beneath the surface as they waited for more. The moderator edged closer, his clipboard clutched like a shield, his tick twitching as he prepared to cut the thread. But Cruz raised a hand, a sharp gesture that stopped him cold, his boots scuffing the tile as he stepped from the podium, abandoning its safety entirely. He crouched before Ava, his suit brushing the floor, his sharp edges blurring into something tender, almost lost. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice a whisper now, barely audible over the fans, but heavy with intent. "Ava," she said, steady, fierce, a quiet strength blooming beneath her breath. Cruz nodded, a faint smile breaking through the cracks, his eyes shimmering with something raw. "You're brave. Ava, braver than me, braver than most." Soft claps rippled through the crowd, fading as the air thickened, heavy with expectation. Ava shifted her weight, her sandals scuffing the tile, and looked up at Cruz with a clarity that cut through the haze. "Daddy says tough means fixing things," she said, her voice a clear chime that sliced through the quiet like a breeze over the plains. "So why are we tough if it keeps getting hotter?" Cruz rocked back, his face crumpling a flash of a man undone. Not a senator, his defiance dissolved VYing into something human and frail. The crowd caught its breath, a nurse's sob breaking free, an oil worker's fist clenching as he nodded, the weight of Ava's words pressing down on every soul in the hall. Cruz stood slowly, his movements deliberate, his hands flexing as he turned to the crowd, his gaze sweeping over them with a heave-ness that hadn't been there before, a shadow of guilt and resolve mingling in his eyes. "She's right to ask," he said, his voice louder now, cracked but rising, cutting through the murmurs like a wave against the shore. "I've been fighting jobs, strength, Texas pride, but if kids like Ava are scared to play outside, if their brothers are falling, then I've missed something big. I've missed Clara's lesson." The room erupted gasps sharp as lightning, sobs spilling from throats too tight to hold them, a swell of disbelief that crashed over the chairs like a flood over the flats. A mechanic leapt to his feet, his hands clasped as sweat glistened on his brow. A grandmother pounded her flyer, her damn right a growl that rumbled through the chaos. A young mom clutched her kid, her whispered truth lost in the din but etched in her glistening eyes. Ava's question had become a mirror, reflecting a fear too real to dismiss, a wound too deep to ignore, and Cruz's admission had lit a fire that blazed through the hall. The KDCIVYC center shook now, a tempest roaring from Ava's spark, fanned by Cruz's unraveling into a blaze that consumed every corner of the space. He stood exposed, his suit creased, his hands flexing as if grasping for a stance he'd lost. Ava held her ground, her sunflower dress a flare of quiet courage against the dimness, her journal a banner of a fear that had flipped the night into chaos and reshaped it into something raw and urgent. The crowd was alive, tears streaked weathered faces, tracing paths through the grime of long shifts, hands clasped in tight, desperate grips, knuckles whitening, eyes blazed with shock, anger, and a dawning resolve that flickered like stars through the haze. Her question, "Why are we tough if it keeps getting hotter?" had torn the room apart, peeling back layers of bravado to reveal a bleeding heart beneath, and Cruz's "I've missed something" had struck the match, igniting a fire that refused to fade. Cruz wiped his brow, his fingers brushing his beard as he stepped back to the podium, but its shield was ash now, a relic of a certainty he couldn't reclaim. "Texas is tough," he'd bellowed on the trail, his voice ringing across oil fields and town squares, a line that once drew roars and raised fists. Now it haunted him, etched into the lines of his face-tight lips pressed into a thin slash, shadowed eyes glistening with a guilt he couldn't bury, a doubt that clung like the Gulf's humidity. The crowd felt it too, their murmurs swelling into a storm soft at first, a ripple of "she's right" and "what about us?" Then louder, a chorus of voices clashing in a symphony of frustration and awakening. A mechanic stood, his cap clutched to his chest, his gravelly "my kid's asthma's worse" cutting through the noise. A nurse beside him rose, her sob breaking as she nodded, her "we lost power last storm" a whisper that carried. A young dad in the back slammed his cup down, his muttered "this ain't tough," a plea that hung heavy. Ava's father leapt up, pulling her close, his Astros cap tumbling as he pressed his lips to her braids, his lean frame trembling with pride and heartbreak. "You're my hero, Ava," he choked out, his voice breaking as tears fell, dripping on her dress to leave dark spots on the sunflowers. Ava nodded, patting his arm with a tenderness beyond her years, her dark eyes locked on Cruz, glistening with a quiet steel that refused to bend. Cruz crouched again, his knees brushing the tile, and reached out with a shaking hand. Ava took idony fingers curling into his trembling palm, a bond forged in the wreckage of a night neither had foreseen. "You're a fighter, Ava," Cruz said, his voice thick with awe, cracking under the weight. "Don't ever stop, okay?" Ava smiled, soft but real, a curve of her lips that lit her face like dawn over the bayou. "Jamal wouldn't," she whispered, her words a dagger and a lifeline, and Cruz froze, Clara's ghost echoing in her resolve. He stood slowly, his boots scuffing as he rose, and turned to the crowd, his voice rising, raw and unshackled, cutting through the chaos like a flare in the dark. "This isn't just my fight," he said, fierce and trembling, his hands slashing the air as if to carve the words into the walls. "It's ours, all of ours. Kids like Ava feel the heat while we bicker over rigs and rules, while we dodge the hard stuff that's burning them down. She's not afraid to call it so. Why are we? Why are we letting summers steal our kids when we can face this together?" The room exploded applause, thundered like a squall. Shouts tore from throats raw with emotion. Chairs scraped as people leapt up in a swell that shook the floor. A nurse stood, sobbing, clapping until her hands bruised. An oil worker pounded his fist, his dam straight, a growl that rumbled through. A young mom lifted her kid, her yes, a chant that wove into the roar. Strangers embraced workers with retirees, moms with mechanics' voices clashing in a cacophony of "We've got to fix it, this is on us, no more waiting," and Ava stood with her dad, a fragile spark, now a blazing torch lighting the night. Cruz raised both hands, stilling the storm with a gesture that trembled but held, his face a battlefield of ruin and fire, cheeks streaked with sweat, eyes alight with a purpose that burned through the haze. "Tomorrow, I'm back in D.C., he said, steady but shaking with resolve. "Not just for oil votes, I'm sitting with kids like Ava, families like your workers, parents, all of you, and we're tackling this together. Tough isn't ignoring, it's fighting for what's real, and I'll be damned if I don't start now." The crowd roared, a tidal wave lifting the roof claps sharp as thunder, cheers ragged with hope, tears streaming down, faces lifted in defiance and unity, and Ava's father hoisted her onto his shoulders, her sunflower dress soaring as she waved her journal like a flare against the dusk. People stood linked by a shared wound, a fragile hope blazing into something fierce, their applause a vow to rise, to face, to mend. As Cruz stepped back, his shoulders slumped but his eyes burning, the room pulsed with a truth that wouldn't fade. An 8-year-old had exposed a titan, not with rage, but with a question too true to duck. "Thank you, Ava," he said, lost in the din, "for waking us up." Ava nodded, braids bouncing, and whispered to her dad, "Jamal be proud, right?" He hugged her tight, tears soaking her dress, his voice a broken sob of love. "So proud, baby girl, so proud." The lights dimmed, but the fire didn't. People lingered, plotting, changed, a community forged in a little girl's courage, her voice echoing beyond the walls to a nation watching. If an 8-year-old could demand more, so could we.